This session is methods and challenges for conducting UX research on first launches and major redesigns, and will be presented by Nick Lange. If you think you might be in the wrong room, now is the chance to change. You may take photos during this presentation, but please be mindful to others around you. This presentation will be recorded. Don't forget to share your experience on social media and make sure to include the official conference hashtag UXPA 2016. Please share your feedback about this session, and the URL should be at the bottom of your slides. Without further ado, I will introduce Nick Lange, and he'll take it from there.
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining our session today. Our primary goal is to be as interesting as the breakfast, so I hope we exceed your expectations there. And we're going to be talking about some of our experiences with product research on redesigns, major redesigns, and also first launches of new products. So just to introduce ourselves a little bit before we get started, I'm a researcher at Facebook. I've been there for a couple of years. I've worked on ads products, and now I work on search. Prior to that, I worked at Microsoft a few years ago with each of us actually intersecting there. So since I moved to California, I've been really into exploring the backcountry and the wilderness there. This is a picture of me from a couple weeks ago at the outset of the trip. I didn't look as optimistic at the end, unfortunately. That's me.
Mine's muted. Hi, I'm Kerry Spaulding. I work at Microsoft, where I've been for a few years. I initially worked on MSN and the MSN apps, and then I've worked on Cortana and Windows. Previously, I've worked with Nick and Max on that. We're very West Coast here with lots of I also enjoy going on hikes. I go on hikes with my dog as well, and so you can see her there in her little backpack. And I also like playing tennis and doing lots of outdoorsy things around Seattle.
Hi, I'm Omar Vasnaik. I'm a researcher at Facebook. I'm actually based out of the Seattle office. I work on Facebook's mobile app install ads. So essentially, every time you go through your mobile news feed and you see an ad that says install now, which takes you to the Play Store or the App Store, that's an app install ad, and that's the product I work on. I've been in Facebook for a year and a half, and prior to that, I was at Microsoft working on a bunch of different things. I did work with Nick and with Max on MSN and on Bing apps. The picture you see there is one of my passions. I'm not making faces, though, but I enjoy running. So every year, every summer, I do the Ragnar Relay. So for runners in the room, if you've done the Ragnar Relay, you know what I'm talking about. It's a 200-mile relay with 12 people. And I do the Washington one, where we start in Blaine, near the Canadian border, and end in the San Juan Islands. And the picture you see there was me running in 90-degree heat in the San Juan Islands, and making faces was the only way for me to amuse myself and keep me sane and alive.
Okay, so I'll start with my picture because it doesn't have me in it, so it's going to confuse everyone until I explain it. I used to do a lot of independent filmmaking before I got into UX. So this is one of the movies I worked on about like 5 or 6 years ago. And since then, I studied cognitive psychology at the University of Chicago. I worked at Microsoft on MSN apps and the Bing apps on Windows 8. And now I work at Google on a lot of the social tools that they have.
All right, so now we'll jump into our conversation. So the first question that I have for you guys is, what kind of evidence can research uncover to suggest or discount the presence of an opportunity for a successful redesign or a new product? Maybe go that way. This one's oh, it's done? All right.
All right, great. So let me kick it off. It's pretty interesting, you know, as a researcher, you sometimes you have certain preconceived notions that you're going to get something out of research. When you set up research, you're going to get certain findings. And what research reveals to you are things that you never even imagined at the outset. To give you an example, I worked on a product called BizTalk Server at Microsoft. It's a business process modeling tool. And it had 4 different audiences. You had a business analyst who builds a business process and who handed over to to a solutions architect who would code up the business process in terms of a solution, who would hand it over to the developer, who would code it up in Visual Studio, and finally an infrastructure architect who would deploy the solution. And each of those different personas would use different products. And when I set off to do research, we wanted to understand, we knew that it was extremely challenging for these different personas to use these individual products. So we set off to do research. We were trying to understand, can we uncover needs to simplify this experience, so to redesign these individual products? And what we came back with was, it wasn't possible. We came back with findings that maybe instead of redesigning the individual parts of each individual product, we need to come up with a brand new product that's the sum of all the parts. And it'll just give you a simplified experience. So think of a business analyst who creates a business process, and with the click of a button, everything else happens behind the scenes. So it breaks down those communication silos between all the different personas. So the point I'm trying to make is, as a researcher, sometimes you inherently go into something thinking that you want to try and find something, and you have certain ideas in mind, and then you come out with totally different findings. It baffles the team and is eye-opening as well. So that's my story about how research may uncover a brand new product.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I've discovered and experienced as well, is that sometimes just in the course of your research on a topic that's of existing interest to you and your team, you kind of naturally and organically uncover something, maybe in one study, but more commonly over time, it just kind of builds up that this latent need is understood for your team. An experience I had with that was at Facebook in advertising, where we were working with a bunch of small to medium-sized businesses who are advertising on tools within the core Facebook app. But we found over time that this really didn't satisfy all their needs. So they didn't like having their personal life connected to their business life necessarily for their advertising aims. And also it was buried within the major app. So what we really uncovered was that they needed a way to separate these processes and scenarios for themselves, so that when they're going on to check in with their friends, they're not when they're going to do ads on Facebook, they're not, distracted by all the goodness that Facebook generally offers. So we split this out into a new app, and we found that that was working a lot better for these small to medium-sized businesses. Yeah. Cool. Do you guys?
Yeah, so I work on a lot of new apps at Google, and one of those is Google Spaces, which came out a couple weeks ago. And while working on that product, what kind of led to it is seeing people try to accomplish certain tasks and having to use many different apps in order to complete the task from the beginning to the end. And we weren't specifically looking at a particular product or changing. If you're just looking at, okay, suppose you want to do something, go ahead and use whatever products you would use in order to do that thing. And we noticed that in a lot of tasks, like people were starting, maybe brainstorming on Pinterest and talking in Hangouts and switching between these different apps. And there was a lot of time lost switching between those apps. So we tried to consolidate some of that kind of task flow into a single experience.
I think everyone else has pretty much talked about being really open-minded for looking for opportunities for a new product design. So I'll speak a little bit too for a redesign. So I think you look to a different type of data for that a lot, which is you have existing usage data from your customers. And so I think that if you're seeing either diminishing use of your product or a feature, or if you aren't seeing the usage patterns that you were hoping for, or maybe you aren't seeing evidence that your product is being as sticky as you would like, so people aren't using it as habitually as you might want. All of those would be opportunities, which would suggest an opportunity that a redesign could be effective at making the product achieve its goals better. So I think it's like a very different type of data, whereas it's very open-ended often for a new product. If you're thinking about a redesign, it's often from the existing usage data that you have.
Great. And then how about the next phase down? So after you've kind of discovered that there's this opportunity space for either a major redesign or a new product in the space, how do you go about uncovering which concepts really resonate for that opportunity?
So one method I really like to use, research-wise, is the rapid iterative testing and evaluation method, where and before you start with the method, you have some sort of design sprint where you're developing a bunch of designs, and you start exposing just a couple users to those designs and trying to figure out what went wrong with the designs, what went right, and just quickly try to iterate to the next for the next set of users, so that within a single day you're actually like exploring a bunch of different ideas and hopefully moving forward in solving the design problem.
Yeah, and just to add to what Max just said, one of the things that I'm working on right now is app install ads, and we know that from our data that we've uncovered that actually creating a campaign is really, really cumbersome and tough for many of our advertisers. So we're working on a way to sort of simplify that experience. So one of the things that we're doing is to how do we come up with a task flow that maps to a user's mental model. Max talked about the rapid iterative testing and evaluation of the right method. Another way is actually using paper prototypes to map to sit down with users and see, does this really map to your mental model? Is this how you're thinking of the task flow? So before you actually jump into actual product design or get to the prototype stage, it start with back of a paper napkin or doodles on a piece of on a paper, and map that journey from when a user in this case starts with what campaign am I going to create to successfully creating that campaign. So what does that journey look like?
Yeah, and along the lines of doing like a rapid iterative type of testing, one of the things that really tells you you're on the right track is pretty obvious when people express or spontaneous excitement about a certain direction. If you're testing multiple potential ways to support certain scenarios or spaces, then when people's eyes light up and express organically how that would be useful for them in various contexts, and that tells you you're on the right path. Of course, you don't want to say, would you use this? That's like one of the largest faux pas possible, right? But when they organically express it themselves, that's very bolstering for that particular direction, I found. Yeah. All right. So in designing and producing a new product, we're often faced with the idea of the minimal viable product and when that threshold is reached. How do you guys view your role as UX researchers in defining when that threshold's met or what that threshold should be?
Yeah, it can be very deceptive to define what the minimal viable product is, especially because the closer you get to a launch, the stronger the need is to kind of de-scope things. A lot of product managers kind of think of their jobs as like, saying no to things and de-scoping things as you kind of go through. And a lot of UX people are kind of put in a position of trying to push back and trying to get as much user value in. So it's kind of like a give and take. A good way is, I think, to really define like what is the critical journey that a user has to go through, kind of like what Omar was saying in the beginning, but like the mental models that you kind of uncover and the journey that the user has to take, that's something that has to not just exist in the beginning, but like get carried over through the entire project, so that is, if it's ever broken, that you can point it out and say, okay, like this flow is now entirely broken, and so we don't have the experience that we need in order for this to work. And then additionally, like testing frequently, especially testing towards the end of the launch cycle, is really important.
I have this one now. But unfortunately, the role often ends up being kind of to be the bearer of bad news, because I feel like people, as the product gets close to launching, people can be really, at times, unrealistically optimistic about how good it is, and how effective it is, because people are really close and attached to it when they've been working on it for a long time. So I think that all of the things that you guys have said in terms of testing the product, making sure that if you've gone through and done your due diligence before and have defined what course is the core scenario for the product and what should the user be able to accomplish, but then I think it's important to make sure that likely they have another solution for solving the problem that your product is trying to solve right now, and your solution needs to be better than the existing solution. So I mean, I think dealing a healthy dose of reality check to teams about what minimally viable in terms of actually getting anyone to use it means is really important at that point in time, and that it probably needs to be better than they think.
So I have a little bit of a different spin to this. One of the things that working on an MVP product, or it's become a buzzword. Defining what minimum is for your product. I think you sort of define that with your users and with your team. But one of the things we do at Facebook is one of our core values is ship love. So when we launch a product, we ship quickly, but we also want to make sure we're shipping love. So the way I think of a minimally viable product is really about more around the lines of a minimally lovable product. I think that's really, really important. And I think the onus of making sure that a product is loved is on you and on us. So very often, from a product team or an engineer, their goal is to get their features out to the world, get it out as quickly as they can. And not to say that they don't want to ship love or they don't care about whether the users actually would like it, but they want to get things out fast. But that's where we come in as designers and researchers. We want to make sure that we don't block the product from shipping fast. We don't stop that, but we are sort of enablers as well as adding love in the whole mix. And I think that's really, really important. And that's one of our core values that we live every day.
So Kari, you touched on one potential problem that comes up or hurdle for redesign is that people are really attached to what they've been working on for so long. I'm curious how you go about kind of promoting the research findings and working towards a new vision based on user feedback.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the most powerful ways is to actually get the people, when people who have been working on it actually come and see users interacting with it, like either in person or you can show them a video of the people interacting. So in person is the best. Or if you can show them a video so that they can really empathize. Like it's much harder to refute seeing an actual customer struggling with the product or feeling frustrated with something or being unable to achieve a goal with it than it is to hear me talk about it. So that's one way to build a lot of empathy with it. I'm also a big fan of having data triangulation for it. So if you have any beta that has launched for it already and you can show from actual usage data and combine that with some lab findings, that can be especially powerful because your role at that point is kind of, I think there's a lot of time there's the point where you know what your findings are and you feel really confident about it and like what are the things that need to change to make it lovable. And then your role is really to be as persuasive as possible to people to get them to buy in. And so like building empathy with the customers, having them actually see it from them so it's not like me fighting them, it's actually them wanting to make it better for them, I think is probably one of the strongest ways to do that.
And there's no better way than actually taking your stakeholders along with you, right? I mean, if we have big budgets and big pockets, obviously you want to put everyone on a plane, take them where you can around the world. It's good in theory, not always practical in reality. So one of the things that we do is maybe sharing research as it happens in context. So live video is a big deal. So go live, where we stream it back to our product teams in real time. So we use Facebook at work. So they have use the same way you look at Facebook, but internally in the company, and we turn on live video. So we're actually with the participant, and the whole product team is watching you, in context, and they're commenting in live, which only you can see. So it's about sharing that, and so you're trying to get them to wear your shoes, to empathize with your customer. So there's no better way than making them feel like they're in Bangalore or in Sao Paulo, even if they couldn't sit on the plane and go with you physically.
And yeah, a lot of the way we kind of think about it a lot is that. User researchers kind of have to push the team to do a little bit more to make it more delightful or more lovable. But sometimes it actually also goes the other way. Sometimes as a user researcher, you might feel like this is absolutely necessary, and the team wants to descope it or deprecate it, get rid of it. And once you actually get in front of users, you realize actually they were right. Like we didn't actually need this, and users found a better way through this flow even without that feature. So it can go both ways.
And what would you say are some major pitfalls with a redesign? Are there specific challenges that come up with a redesign in addition to what we discussed?
Well, so yeah, I think definitely. I mean, I think, so the biggest challenge, I think, is that you have a set of users who already have habits associated with your product, and the longer that they've been using the product, and at Microsoft, we have some products that people have been using for a very long time, for decades, right? So people have incredibly established habits, even if that might not be the way that, if you were designing it today in today's context, you might not want to make it the same way because the norms around technology and standards are all sort of different. So you're constantly balancing, okay, how do we still not confuse users because they've established one way of doing it with, with continuing to innovate and change it. And I mean, I think one of the ways is like, sometimes you can change the details of things if you still give them a way to achieve their core goals. And sometimes that means that you really need to learn what their core goals are. So an example from MSN where we learned after the fact that it launched that in Brazil, horoscopes were huge. And it was the main reason that people came to the page was to check their horoscopes. And that was a big deal. And that we had gotten rid of that feature and people squawked very, very loudly. So, I mean, I think doing the best job you can possibly before you redesign to understand in different cultures and markets, what are the core things that people actually come to your product to achieve, and making sure that they have clear paths to do that in the new version.
So I've worked on a redesign at Microsoft with Kari, and then also a few at Google. And there can be a difference in how much you care about your current users. So on MSN, we had ad revenue, and it was very important to maintain that ad revenue and maintain our existing users while getting new users. At Google, a lot of the services are free, and they're more, the way Google thinks about it is they're willing for it to grow really big or to die off, and they're just willing to experiment. So if existing Google service is getting redesigned, a lot of times they don't particularly care don't care is a strong word. They do care, but they're willing to take the risk of losing all their existing users to get the new users, which is something that not all redesigns are willing to do. So a big thing is how important is it for you to maintain your existing users as you try to attract new users?
So Max and Kerry talked about the risk associated with the users. There's also a risk associated with your stakeholders. I think that's important to keep in mind as well, and setting those expectations. One of the things is no matter how much testing you do, experiments you run before you launch, once you launch, something else happens, something that you never expected. The product may tank, in the first few days, or it may spike, or it may have these ups and downs. So I think it's really, really important to set expectations with your stakeholders, and also setting maybe established metrics up front, and knowing when to evaluate the product. You don't launch a product on Friday and start testing it on Monday to find out whether the world loves it, right? It's too soon, maybe. Maybe there's a novelty effect. That's why you're seeing this huge spike, which 2 weeks later, no one's using your product. So it's setting those realistic expectations with stakeholders. I mean, if everything was hunky-dory, then every product that every company launched would be successful, and that's not really true. So that's another thing to keep in mind as far as risks associated with the actual stakeholders for a product redesign.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, giving it some time to equalize, for sure. You don't want to just see the initial people that flood into the product when it's new and is promoted in the App Store or has marketing behind it, but you want to see who is actually adopting the product over time and where that kind of normalizes to.
Yeah, and a good example of that is, a few years ago, Facebook launched Facebook Paper. It shot up to the #1 product in the App Store. Today, it's nowhere to be found. But there was a clear indication that it was a really good product, beautiful design, tested very well, but it didn't take off. So those are things that, as researchers or designers or as product people, that you have to keep in mind that things may not always go to plan. So.
All right, so we've talked about some considerations before the redesign launches or the product launches. How do you guys feel about the shift in research questions or methodologies once the redesign or product is launched?
Yeah, so once you launch, quantitative metrics become a lot more important. You have to, now you have a whole new data set, and it's, I think, very important to triangulate the findings that you're getting qualitatively with the stuff that's really happening out there in the world. And no matter how much research you do before the launch, you're going to be surprised by how users are taking advantage of your app. Like, there will be some users that are using it exactly the way you anticipated, but there's going to be some users who you didn't really think about and are taking it in novel ways. So on Google Spaces, for example, we were looking at consumers who are sharing in order to plan trips and so forth, but we weren't really looking at teachers or educators, and we were kind of surprised after launch to see so many teachers and school teachers using Google Spaces and talking about how they want to use it in the classroom. And that was something that wasn't even remotely on our radar before we launched, that is now on our radar, and we're looking at it very closely.
Another thing to note is after the product launches and all of this data is suddenly, all of the actual usage data is actually flowing in, and people are trying to figure out, like, there are all of these puzzles that get generated by that, because it's like, oh, people are using this, they aren't using this, why aren't they using this? Like, these types of questions come up, and it actually can be, for me, I find that to be a really fun time period for research, because there's often this great hunger for trying to understand why things happen. And on my team, we have a notion called a durable insight. So it's like we try to record types, like insights that we find from different studies, whether from this lab study on this product or on that product, or things we know from academic literature, or things from different areas, and make sure we have a database of those so that we can go try to figure out, like, what do we know about feeds and why people use them and when people don't use them, and things like that. And so a lot of what we'll do is we'll try to like generate reports and analyses that try to at least hypothesize why we might be seeing some of the different patterns that we're seeing. And it tends to be a time period when stakeholders are very receptive to getting those types of insights, even if like right before they were launching and they were like scrambling to get everything done, they weren't super receptive to necessarily hearing everything that we had to say.
Well, and Max talked about getting quantitative metrics is important. I think one of the other things too is we work with data scientists, and they crunch numbers and they look at spikes and look at come up with churn reports like every day. But they can never tell you sometimes what the whys are behind a lot of those things, especially after a product is launched, right? They can form a hypothesis of why we think users are doing something, but there's no definitive way of saying that. And that's where sort of research plays in. You have a hypothesis, you have the data that several millions of users did something like that, and that's why we're seeing this spike, or they did something at a certain time of day, but we don't know why, or we see something, an anomaly in a certain country, which is very different. Maybe APAC showed a very different trend as opposed to LATAM. We don't know why. So that's where we sort of can play that role once the product ships, and do quant surveys maybe to follow up, and then do some qual research, like maybe in-person visits or actual contextual inquiries, or whatever the method would be to uncover the whys behind some of the numbers that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think, of course, pairing quant and qual, as in most cases, is especially useful after launch. For a product that I launched at Facebook was a lightweight advertising tool, and we had intended it to serve just SMBs primarily, but then what we saw after the launch was that a lot of kind of agency advertisers and professionals came into the product just by virtue of them being essentially the most invested in their advertising performance, and they spend the most time on advertising relative to SMBs that are multitasked with taking care of everything else in their business. So we kind of had this inflection point of seeing this strong engagement from this population, understanding if that's something we should then invest in supporting more strongly, or if we stay true to our vision of supporting SMBs primarily. So we did a lot of qual work. We did diary studies with the population that we had intended, and also this new population that came in. And so the qualitative work there showed us like the value of the scenarios that each of these groups were getting, and that was kind of important for setting road mapping ahead and trying to serve both of these groups equally well. And then, yeah, surveys absolutely kind of show you on a more broad level where the satisfaction is hitting for various groups. So, yeah, getting more numbers behind that was exceptionally helpful in my case as well.
So it's good to have a plan of what type of research you would kick off post-launch, but obviously be flexible enough to adapt your plan to things that you didn't anticipate or surprises that come along the way. But it's good to have a plan. I mean, but in reality, things will change.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like Kari was saying, the launch kind of exposes all these kind of puzzles and anomalies, and I think like for us as UX researchers, we kind of sit in potentially the most interesting seat for a launch because while engineers and PMs and designers have put all this effort in to get that out the door, we're the ones that at that inflection point are really trying to understand and have the opportunity to go and grapple with these puzzles that come up. So I think that's a nice thing that we get to do.
One other aspect of that is I think it's also important that there are lots of hypotheses generated and there are lots of patterns that will be seen, and some of them, the explanations will be really boring and they don't need research too. So sometimes the difference where you see a difference in APAC is because there's some feature that's not working right there or something along those lines. So I think it's important to be responsive to the team during that time period, but not necessarily reactive and trying to generate out a study for every pattern that they see, but to take a pause moment and try to understand what's going on a little bit first, so that you're not just running around conducting studies on everything when some of the explanations aren't really a user experience or a research problem to figure out. There's some technical thing that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I love that you said that, Kerry. How often have we heard a product manager running up to you and say, I need a study for this. I just saw this. I need a study for that. They have this a la carte menu of I need a study for X, Y, and Z. And that's when you have to actually push back, take a step back, think about the larger problem, think about really what are you trying to answer. I mean, and that's where your expertise kicks in. Rather than them leading down the path, you need to take them down a certain path, because that's what we bring to the table as researchers.
Great. So we shared some of our stories here and some of our experiences, but we're really curious on what you guys are interested in hearing about. So I'd just like to open it up to everyone here for questions at this point. You have a pretty diverse group of companies here, so happy to answer anything you're interested in. Yeah, please. And I think there's a microphone there, actually.
So for major redesigns, how do you balance, or how have you figured out how to balance the, oh, we just need to put it back the way it was, versus, no, we really do need a redesign?
I think it's helpful to get in writing what risk you're willing to put. I've never seen a redesign that's radical, that wasn't associated with a drop of old users. I mean, every time our apps even change something small, the current user base reacts very negatively at first, and then a lot of times you just get used to it. So you got to be comfortable with losing a certain number of people, and it's important to get people at least cognitively aware that there's going to be a loss, and if you write it down, then after the launch when everyone's panicking, because they're going to panic whether they cognitively understood or not, just emotionally seeing the graph go down is just very hard. So you can bring that document back. It's remember, we agreed a month before this launch that we were going to be okay if 10 or 20% of people don't use this anymore, because we're hoping that X amount of people might try it in the future because of this. So I think the documentation is super important.
And in some cases, the redesign, no matter what, with all the studies, may not work. And the classic example that comes to mind is when Microsoft redesigned, Windows 8. They took away the start button. You know the story, right? Users went ballistic on the internet. Everyone wanted the start button back, and what did they do? They brought it right back. So, there is a sense of, setting some realistic expectations. Like Max said, having a document. But I think at a certain point, no matter how much is done, the business takes over at some point when they see that things are floundering. But as researchers, and we need to do our part.
I think use a graph like from an old paper, the change aversion graph with people a lot, just to like before the launch happens, and then to say, you know, like we expect to see this, but then if it's doing well, you expect to see a rebound. So we need to be tracking metrics over time and experience metrics, not just usage metrics. So, you know, and we'll see those patterns, and just like building that expectation and saying, you know, we need to wait and reassess this because we should expect it to go up if it's doing well is one way that I think can be really useful. I had another thought and now it's completely escaping me on it. It was good. It was good. Can't have been that good. But that's one way.
Yeah, please.
So actually what you just said gave me a thought. Any tips on communication, like proactive communication to your user base? Hey, this redesign is coming. How early, how often, setting expectations. I just think communication is really important. I wondered if you guys had any tips on that. Thank you.
One technique, like for the product itself, that has been shown to be effective previously is to initially let users try it and then revert, at least for a time period, so that they don't feel like you immediately yanked their safe security blanket old version of the product away. They can use that new version and then, but still go back and potentially give you feedback on the aspects of the new version that they don't like as much. So I think that's one way of doing it.
And I think we're seeing more and more of that. You know, a lot of companies have, you know, you can click a button on the top to switch back to the old UI, and then with a countdown clock that old UI will be gone forever, right? So it's as Kerry says, it's sort of the warm-up period before you know that things are going to switch. The switch is going to flip forever.
So this is more the exception than the rule, but I've seen a few times where it's been literally explained to the user base why the design change was made, and explaining explicitly like why the old design is less efficient than the new design, or what's improved about the new design. A lot of times companies don't do this, but I've seen that when it is done, then users, even if they disagree with the design change, and if they see the rationale, they feel a lot better because they feel like, okay, at least they're trying to take care of us, as opposed to just arbitrarily changing things because, you know, that's what they do over there.
And I think that's where you work closely with your marketing teams and whatnot, right? To set that communication and those expectations, because there's only so much you can reveal before a product actually goes public, but it obviously has to be done in some type of phased manner.
Yes, I believe it was Max that mentioned that you like to work with rapid iterations in between making changes, and I'm curious a little more of the logistics of that in terms of scheduling the participants ahead of time. You don't necessarily know how much time you'll need to make the update, so what would be the minimum, the shortest iteration, and how many participants would you want?
Yeah, so I actually use this method quite a bit, and the way I use it is a little bit different in the beginning of a product cycle than towards the end of an iteration cycle. So in the beginning, you're going to have to make big changes. So sometimes I would schedule 2 users on a Tuesday and schedule the next 2 users on a Thursday. So there's all of Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday to iterate. But then as you kind of get closer to your final solution, you can start doing it within a single day. So Tuesday in the morning, you have a couple people, you take a 2-hour break, and then you do 2 more people. It's something that you kind of feel out. I would start with a bigger gap in the beginning and kind of close it over time.
So I have a situation I'd like you to just talk about for a second. It's about a product, so it's a redesign. It's also an expansion of an existing product. It's ongoing. They've released. They have the ear of a couple of subject matter experts. There's no other UX on the team. They're continuing, and you're brought in, and now you don't have access to users at this point, but you have to come in and figure out what needs to be done while all this is happening, and they're not going to wait. What do you do?
What do you have access to? I guess being unable to get user feedback is quite the constraint.
Well, you kind of have to sort of build it. So how do you build it and ramp up? You know, you have connections, so you have the potential connections, but it's a matter of, you know, thoughts about how you get the access to the users, how, you know, you get the ear of the team, how you know, what you're going to touch on first, how are you going to break down the product. It's like it's a complex new product, and again, it's a release that may not have been a very good release, and a lot of work needs to be done. So in that situation, sort of how would you approach it for you to be in that situation, and what would you do?
So what I would do in that scenario, if you have no access to users and you don't have much time, if possible, if they're, you know, to do some type of competitive evaluation. So look at, you know, what are the other competitors in the space and how their products, you know, are designed or are work. At least you can form some type of hypothesis on your own product. And again, it's not ideal. It's just because you don't have access to users. So, but that's something that you could at least form as a basis to start off with. Do you guys have any other ideas?
Yeah, depending on the complexity of the user group, you may be able to do some type of heuristic valuation or internal dog fooding with people that are less close to the product side, just to get some kind of feedback loop going to expose the strengths and weaknesses of the current direction.
But you need to get users. I mean, part of the question is you do need to get users. So, I mean, because that has to happen, because this is the beginning of a sort of a long-term research. That's why you're brought in there. So again, it's sort of building this, you know, so much of building a framework to continue and to move forward. So that's also part of the question as well, to try and, I mean, any experience in kind of rapidly, basically building yourself out as a UX research group in an ongoing product. That is, the path is, it's on a train and it's going.
If you do have a really targeted user, population, then I think trying to establish, you know, a database or a set of users that you can recontact and getting them to agree to participate. So either getting links out there so that people can agree to sign up to be contacted about research, or if it's for a specific population, making sure that it's on, you know, targeting that. So it's towards like a website that they go to or in a place that they go to or things like that. And then if you have a set of people who've consented, it often, especially if there are major issues in the product, it often doesn't take that many users, and it doesn't necessarily take that long to identify major issues. You know, if you just throw them in front of the product and have them interact with it naturally for a fairly short period of time, they're probably going to uncover some major flaws, or you can back up what those are. So I would say, like, just scrappily get out there and try to get contacts out into places where your target population is, so that you can start developing a database of users.
There are even companies that have panels, and I don't know how specialized the users you're looking for, but there are panels out there. So, you know, like Kerry said, anything scrappy to get to your target population is the ideal path to follow.
Hi. When you design or create a new tool that lets people do the task that they're doing right now, but in a completely new way, and if they actually do migrate, they get a lot out of it, but they tend to stay in their comfort zone, especially in enterprises, because the risk is high, the loss can be really high. So do you have any strategies for getting people to try the new product, get them out of their comfort zone?
So there's a lot of answers to this. One of it is making onboarding very easy, making it like seamless to get in. If you have like a long sign-on form to get into your product, to just try it out, I mean, that's a huge barrier. So you just want to get rid of as many barriers as possible, so you can almost like slip into the new product and hopefully, you know, spend enough time there that you actually get entrenched and can start shifting away from the old product. I feel like a lot of products have too many barriers to entry, and that kind of prevents people from even trying to switch over. Even the act of like having to download a native app for a lot of people is like a huge barrier. It's like, oh, I have to download another app on my phone. I have so many apps on my phone, and it takes like 2 seconds. You just click a button. At least on US phones where we have a lot of memory, like it's just very easy to download an app, and even that seems like huge friction. So, and some of the apps I've worked on, like having a mobile web experience helped a lot, where you just click on the link and now you're in the product. It removed some of that friction.
And to add to that, having really nice contextual help within the product. So where the product actually takes the user down a certain path and they're not floundering around, right? And an example that comes to mind is Slack. So if you have used Slack, if you're a brand new first-time user, look how beautifully they take you down a certain path, and you feel like they're anticipating the questions that you have, when you're stuck. And I think a lot of companies do this right now. So I used Google Docs. Max had put together Google Docs for this talk, and I never used it before. But it had these little bubbles that came up to sort of educate me on what to do, and I had never used it before. So I quickly got accustomed to doing that. So those little things they seem little, but they're a big deal to a brand new user, and especially in the enterprise space.
And risk aversion does tend to be associated, I don't know if you're familiar with Margaret Burnett's work on gender mag facets and all of it, but risk aversion tends to be associated with a greater desire for guided help as opposed to wanting to tinker to figure out the product. And people are more risk averse in general when it is something they need to use to achieve a productivity goal. So the extent to which the barriers can get really low, and then they have contextual help. But I also think that if there is one core task that your product does way better, to somehow get people hooked in to do that one thing, if you can get them to use your product for that one thing, and then they get comfortable with the experience, like if they get comfortable with the experience, then they could start using it for more too.
And just to chime in on that, I think opt-in is definitely a very powerful mechanism, and not forcing people in, but giving them the opportunity to just play around for a minute when they're less stressed or less needing to get the task done, but when they have the opportunity to explore on their own time, then they can go in, and when they really need to get to their core workflow and just get that task done, then they can go back for a moment. I think just having that flexibility goes a long way with getting people in and experiencing the product in a way that doesn't feel pressured.
And so this strategy is not going to work for most things, but for some things it might make sense to kind of integrate with the product that you're competing with in some way, where you can start a workflow on your competitor's product, but do that task that's really nice on your product in a very easy way, so people can kind of use both products for a while, and then over time maybe switch over to yours exclusively.
Hi, you all have talked a lot about goals and core tasks. I'm curious if you can talk about the different criteria you use to define what is core and what is not. Maybe give some examples of those types of decisions you've had to make.
So at Google, we have this concept of a critical user journey, and most products are asked to define it right away. So we have just a list of tasks that we decide up front, which ones are important. If you get consensus on the whole team, like these are our 5 tasks. And the way we generate them is, whatever the value prop of the product is, there's usually a core task around that. There's usually a core task around onboarding to that new product if you're a new user. And a lot of times it can be very clear like what the core task should be if you're really thinking about the product in the big pictures. Other times it can be a little bit more challenging if you have a very flexible platform. But in that case, people use a lot of survey methodology to kind of ask users like, how often are you in this sort of situation, or have you ever been in that sort of situation, and kind of get a gauge on which tasks are more common than other tasks. And if it's a redesign, then you have the existing data of the product to go on a little bit too.
Sure, and I think another way that you can provide focus to what's core and what's peripheral is through the group or demographic that you're trying to target or make the product for. So for instance, I talked about this app that we made for SMBs. So that by just focusing our research around their needs, that helped us understand like the primary scenarios and use cases we wanted to support in the product specifically for them. Whereas if we had focused on agencies or professional advertisers, then those primary objectives would have been a lot different. So I think just scoping down to the group you want to focus on helps a lot in that regard.
And in case people are wondering, SMBs are small and medium businesses, so just to undefine it for people.
To what?
Just to clarify what an SMB is.
Oh, yeah. Small to medium-sized businesses, right.
And just one other added, I think this is a really good question because I think it's actually really hard to define sometimes. Like I think it's inherently it's not a real categorical distinction, right? You're drawing a cutoff line somewhere where you think things above the cut line are important and things below the cut line don't meet this distinction. And I think that it's easy for people to want to creep that cut line much lower than it really is. So I do think that like pushing to constrain what you define as the core tasks to just the core tasks. And like MSN is an example where the site was really big and there were lots of different tasks, and every team that's working on a different feature thinks that their feature is a core task, but the reality is that most people were coming to check the news headlines, and so like really making sure you nailed the news headline experience was so much more important than everything else. And I think that was something that like I learned in my research after the product had launched, and I wished I had defined better before it had launched. So, I mean, I think being really hard, like taking a really hard stance of like, it's not that nothing else is important, but really being honest with yourself about the real reason why people are coming to use your product.
And so there's actually two core tasks that have slightly different rules. So one of the types of core tasks is like the pivotal task that a user might run into only once, but it's extremely important that they have a really great experience. So that's like when they first get into your product for the first time. Or in Google Spaces, we have a search functionality if you're trying to retrieve something that you put there, and it's not something that we would expect someone would use on a daily basis, but when they do use search, it's very important that they find what they want. And then there's the other kind of pivotal tasks, critical journeys, where people are doing it literally every day, and so it's it might be very small things in those journeys. Over time can become like huge annoyances. So in Google Spaces, it's, for example, chatting. And so if you're supposed to chat every day and there's a little bit of something that's kind of like gets in your way there, and it's not that big of a deal once, but like if you have to run into it every single day, it becomes a huge problem.
You guys talked a little bit about UX metrics and how to measure success of a redesign, not necessarily from the product perspective, but from the UX perspective. Can you talk a little bit about what UX metrics you use and how you go about getting that data?
Yeah, so I mean, in Windows, we actually have a mechanism with our Insiders program where they get a little pop-up. They get a little pop-up survey that's contextual. And so one of the things that to define UX metrics, it's often you're trying to assess, psychological constructs. So like user attitudes, their love of the product, their satisfaction. And so you can try to define that behaviorally. So that's one attempt that people will do. But that can be a bit tricky because people will conflate usage with happiness, and in some cases that's true, and in some cases it's not really true because, for example, with email, people could be unhappy for quite a long time, but they have quite a bit of investment in their current email, and you're not going to see probably a slow decline over time because they still need to use the tool. You're going to see a rapid drop off all of a sudden when they switch emails entirely. So if you're relying on usage to reflect happiness, in that case, then it can be a bit problematic. So this is when we will use the contextual small-scale surveys is one of the methods for doing that to assess their satisfaction or how useful they find something. And then we also take in open-ended feedback for that, which can be really useful as well.
A good common ground for the product and the UX research team is often retention, because retention is a metric that's kind of reflective of how the user feels about the product in a way. I mean, there's concerns that Kari raised with like if you really have to use a tool, but for a lot of consumer apps where it's very easy to switch out of, retention can be extremely good, and it's a lot more telling than engagement, where people could be consuming more content or spending more time, and it doesn't mean anything about how happy they are or how hard it would be for a competitor to just come in and take them.
And engagement can be across people, and retention is at the individual user level. So you do have some idea that they're getting value repeatedly at the individual user level, rather than like relying on engagement, which can be averaged across a whole bunch of people. So you don't know if people are churning out and you're acquiring new people, but retention, you get a really good pulse on people's actual usage there. So yeah, and then in general, I think what Kerry's saying is true in my experience as well. Survey data for satisfaction definitely goes a long way for understanding how the product's being received. Yeah. No, go ahead.
And just one other thing with getting that, when you do get that experience data, I think that like just getting it is only like one step. You have to get people to take that take that seriously. And I think reiterating over and over that like your goal is to get long-term usage, not short-term usage, and like to retain customers over the long term, and like why your metrics are canaries in the coal mine for that long-term usage, because we can't actually measure your usage in 2 years right now. And so we're trying to predict that based on all of the measures that we have right now. And so I think continuing to advocate for the UX metrics is also really important.
And also doing your role in sort of explaining those metrics and explaining the data, because very often stakeholders will want that magic number and they'll run with it. And that's all they care about, right? Especially folks on, maybe on the engineering or product teams, like, what is that number? Is my user happy or not? And like, they just take and run with it. So it's about, like Kerry mentioned, right? So pairing up the metrics with some of the open-ended comments. So giving them that holistic picture. I think that's really important, and that's what, researcher needs to do.
That actually raises a very interesting question about the metrics, because most of the talk, it seems like, has been around unidimensional scales, satisfaction, ease of use. But for any interaction, it's actually a fairly multidimensional construct and interaction that's going on. So the question is, do you choose just unidimensional? Do you actually have some sort of multidimensional scales, or some patterns of scales and ratings that you seem to be more effective in actually assessing some of this multidimensional aspect of the interactions moving forward?
I don't know if I have anything to address that in terms of a scale or multidimensional scale approach, but I think the important thing in my experience has just been to keep in mind the context of the product and all the use cases it's serving. So you can assess satisfaction with a product at the whole, but really what you want to know is typically something a little bit more fine-grained and contextual. So their satisfaction with getting task A, task B, task C completed is where I try to focus a little bit more, just because that might be obscured when you're talking about the product as a whole.
I think if it's to go along with what Nick's saying, I think if you're getting the feedback from in the product itself, I think keeping it pretty simple is good. So staying in one dimension, but making sure it's, as Nick was saying, like at the level of what you're interested in. So if you're making changes to one little part of a product, to not assess, like if you assess global satisfaction with Windows and then try to see whether making a change to one small part of the start menu is affecting that, you're probably never going to see a change in that. But if you assess their satisfaction with the start menu, then you could see it. I think if you're in the lab or you're doing benchmarking, people do use, we do use multidimensional scales. So like we use the, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget them, SUS, and another one that is like from the SAR. I don't do them in general. And sometimes you see interesting patterns where things diverge in those in terms of like how, whether they are satisfied with the product versus whether they would expect to return. And sometimes if you see differentials, that can be useful and uncover interesting patterns. But a lot of times they also kind of clump together. So I think it depends on the specific product.
So we're just out of time here. So yeah, thanks everybody for all your questions. Really appreciate it. Thanks.